One man, one mission, watch all Walt Disney movies. This is Death by Disney. Hello, welcome to the Death by Disney podcast. I'm your host, Adam, and I have a wonderful movie to talk about today. We're going to talk about Bambi. Before we do that, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the podcast, what I'm doing. I'm trying to watch all Disney movies, and there's only two rules to this. I can watch them in any order, but the documentation of me watching them has to be chronologically. So, Bambi is the next movie on the list. I'm sure everybody in the world has seen Bambi, but if you haven't, Bambi. This is the summation, the summary from Disney. Bambi is the life story of a fawn, Bambi, who grows up with friends Thumper, the rabbit, and Flower, the skunk, to be the great prince of the forest. You want some Bambi trivia? Well, I'll give you some Bambi trivia. Now, here's the first one. 6-year-old Peter Ben auditioned with several other children for the voice roles of Mother Rabbit's children. When Benson said to the line, in reference to Bambi, "Did the young prince fall down?" a casting director who was watching the audition in another room shouted, "Get that kid out of here, he can't act." However, the Disney animators who heard the audition tape loved the sound of Ben's voice. Ben was called back to the studio, and the character of Thumper was created largely based on his vocal performance. And when you watch the movie, Thumper is a pretty, I don't want to say iconic, because that suggests that it's good. It's not bad, but it's certainly distinctive. And I wonder what happened to that casting, the casting director who was like that, who mentioned that he couldn't act. Did he have a job after that? Maybe not. Another interesting thing, probably this is an urban legend, but it's interesting to talk about anyway. In December 2018, a Missourian poacher was sentenced to 1 year in prison for illegally killing deer for trophies. As part of his penalty, he was required to watch this movie once a month. For obvious reasons. The obvious reasons are that the Disney synopsis of the plot doesn't really tell you what happens in the movie, and it's not a secret. It's pretty famous that in this movie, Bambi's mother is killed. And it's a pretty tragic thing, but I'll talk about that later. So, yeah. I wonder if he is like, yes, I know. Like, how did that work? He's sitting in prison, and then the jailers had to sit him in front of the TV, and he had to watch Bambi once a month. Yeah. That's only like 12 times. You could do that. That's not the worst punishment, I think. Probably the jail was worse than the Bambi, I would think. Okay, the next piece of trivia. There are approximately only 1,000 words of dialogue throughout the entire film, then the rest is all silence. Maybe not silence, it's more like nature doing nature things. Pretty interesting too, because probably I'll be speaking more than 1,000 words in this podcast, and this podcast isn't very long. So you can imagine how little is actually said in the movie. And the last bit of interesting trivia for the movie is that the release gap between the movie and its sequel, yes, there is a sequel to this movie called Bambi 2, The Great Prince, in 2006. So the gap between the first one and the sequel is 64 years. So That's the world record for the longest span of time between two consecutive installments of a franchise. 64 years. So maybe they'll make another black hole movie, and maybe that will beat the record. I think they'll probably reboot that. Anyway, that's the trivia. So, what did I think of Bambi? It's an interesting experience to go back and watch these classic Disney movies as an adult. I never really liked a lot of Disney movies when I was younger, so to try and understand their appeal as an adult is sometimes more difficult for me. The flaws of some of the early films are not present in this one. It doesn't feel rushed like in Dumbo. The animation, while not attaining the heights that were reached in the detail of Pinocchio, also is not as creepy as some of the humans in Snow White. The story itself is pretty basic, but it works for the film. You believe that Bambi is a deer, and this is what happens to deer when they grow up. My standard of judging the success of a Disney film is if I would recommend kids to watch it, or rather, which film would I recommend that they watch the most. So I still think that they would enjoy Pinocchio better than Bambi, but if you wanted to show them more films, I think Bambi would be an acceptable alternative. But be prepared for a difficult conversation about life and death. It's interesting how in the previous film, Dumbo shows really objectively horrible animal abuse, and it's just accepted as part of circus life, and Bambi shows the somewhat realistic lives of animals in the forest, and the threat that humans pose to them. And by doing this, it's a movie that has convinced a lot of people to think differently about animals and animal rights. I just find the juxtaposition... Oh, that's a hard word to say. I just find the juxtaposition of those two films very interesting. Okay, so that's what I thought about the film, but obviously other people have other opinions, and I'd like to read you a really good review. I mean, I'm not judging the quality of the reviews. I'm judging what they say about the movie. So a review with a positive opinion about the film and a review with a negative opinion about the film. And we'll start with the negative ones. And I think it's quite telling that there are, on the Internet Movie Database, there are like, for example, something like 1,000 reviews that people have written about Bambi over the time frame that the site has been up, and there are no 1-star reviews. There are no 2-star, 3-star. 4 is the lowest that anybody rated it, which I think that tells you right there that, and with such a large amount of ratings, so it's a wide population. I don't know how do you call that, but it's a wide sample size of people, and there's very few low ratings. So that tells you that the film is actually quite good. So here's the negative review. Its title is Probably the Blandest Disney Animated Film, and this is from Blotch2319-124, June 2022. Filmmakers are welcome to make whatever film they want. However, it's so rare that I sit back and wonder why they choose to make a particular movie like I did with Bambi. A coming-of-age tale about a deer is an odd subject to focus on, particularly in the old days of hand-drawn animation. That means it took a lot of time to make for an entire studio of artists. In general, I'm not a huge fan of coming-of-age dramas of any kind, and don't find that making it about forest creatures makes it any better. but it doesn't have the more annoying elements that you see in these stories, so it could be worse. If anything, I was kind of bored with this story rather than bothered by it. There's simply not much going on here as we watch a number of animals grow from babies to adults, occasionally dealing with something deeper like loss or love, but mostly just being animals. One thing I can say about Bambi is that it is truly beautiful. The visuals are rendered with great artistic skill and make me nostalgic for the classic cell animation that took time but delivered excellent results. The score is also remarkable and used well to choreograph large chunks of the movie. In fact, there are many times when this feels like scenes cut straight from Fantasia. There's more music than dialogue in the film, which I guess is okay because the scenes with no dialogue are far more compelling than the others. There are really only two things that I actively dislike in Bambi. One is the strange way it seems these animals, that all live in close proximity to one another, keep entering new scenes as if they haven't seen each other in years. The other is the general lack of compelling story to set it apart as something that would draw me in. I could never fault the artistry, I just wish it was used to tell a different story. Wow. So that's a good example of how art is very subjective and our opinions about art are very subjective, because it seems like this person's biggest problem with the film is that it's a coming of age film. And honestly, for me, there are a lot of great coming of age films. And even ones that you don't think of necessarily as being coming of age films actually are, like Star Wars is a coming of age film. In fact, that's about like any part. Like I was thinking about the original series, but the prequels are coming of age films and the sequels also are coming of age films. So it's really popular with people coming of age films. So this guy must have a person. I don't know if it's a guy or not. This person must have a lot of problems enjoying media, because that's kind of like the one of the main stories in life is growing up and getting older and making mistakes and learning from your mistakes. As a person who is far beyond that period of time, I can understand why it might be appealing some other stories, like being middle-aged and dealing with the results of your choices that you made earlier. But I can still appreciate a coming of age story. I mean, who can't? This person, obviously. The other thing that they mentioned in the film was that, you know, the forest was so small and then the animals were acting like they hadn't seen each other in months. Well, maybe this person was so bored that they didn't actually pay enough attention, but there's like different seasons, right? And the animals were hibernating. That's why they didn't see each other for so long. But yeah, you can't fault somebody if they're bored for not paying attention, but that is the answer to that particular question. Okay, now let's talk about a good review about. I said that in a very Canadian way, but I am Canadian, so it's okay. This is a 10 out of 10 review. There's lots for this movie because it's a good movie. It's called The Last of Its Kind by Spleen18, and this is from July 1999. I want to party like it's 1999, people. He or she says, although with a name like Spleen, you'd think it's a guy, but who knows. Walt Disney didn't make another full-length animated film until 1950, by which time his golden age had well and truly passed. Was Bambi a quiet, gentle farewell then? If you haven't seen it, you could be forgiven for thinking so, and the slightly over-sugared opening scenes might confirm this view, but be prepared to be jolted out of your seat. The forest contains darkness as well as light. The gunshots that ring out across the silences are truly alarming, and there are many ways Disney in hand to make them more alarming. Consider the scene where a flock of birds are cowering in the grass. until one decides to fly into the air and risk death rather than put up with the suspense. Also worth noting about Bambi is its use of psychological color. In at least three key scenes, the color scheme shifts wildly, not because the sun has set or anything of that kind, but in order to illustrate Bambi's psychological state. Particularly fine is the scene where he's running away from the clearing in fear, and the world turns into just a few pale and dirty shades of yellow. The greatest thing is the way Disney manages to convince us that there is nothing else in the world outside the forest. Not once do we see a horizon, nor do we sense one. By some standards, not much happens in the forest. A few deaths, a few births, but what else is new? But when the forest is the whole world, they matter a great deal. Wow, that is a great review. I wish my reviews were so poetic. But yeah, a couple of things about that. Like I said, it's a great review. It's very poetic. But I think a few things that I would take a little bit of issue with is that this is it is the last full-length featured animated film, and we're going to be talking about why in the next couple of episodes. Probably 10 or so episodes, because that's how many films there are until Cinderella. But I think some of the films that are in that time frame do have some charm, and they're worth watching. Some of them are really horrible, like Song of the South, but I think that Cinderella is a great Disney film. In fact, it's one of my favorite Disney films. I really like it, and I think it's much better than what came before. So, what is the classic Disney, I think just depends on your subjective taste and, your generation, probably. And I wouldn't be surprised if this person grew up with Bambi, and Bambi was the first Disney movie that made any kind of impression on them. Also, it's kind of weird to say, there's nothing really happens, a few deaths. Deaths for anyone is probably pretty dramatic. I mean, animals don't have a lot of time to mourn the loss of their family and friends, but they do so, obviously. So yeah, those are so I gave you some trivia about Bambi. I told you how I feel about Bambi. I told you how other people feel about Bambi. But yeah, it's a pretty good film, unless you don't like coming of age films. So this has been Death by Disney. Please tune in to the podcast next week, where I will be talking about Saludos Amigos. So, not saludos, but adios, amigos.